21st Century Faith. 21st Century Faith is a program brought to you by Aspect Ministries and features topics and guests that explore contemporary ways of reaching younger people and unchurched adults with the unchanging good news of the gospel. Now here's our speaker, the founder and director of Aspect Ministries, pastor, teacher, and author, Mike Bogart.
Hello and welcome to 21st Century Faith. So glad you're with us tonight on our show. We have a great show planned for you. And Aspect Ministries is the sponsor of 21st Century Faith. And so glad to bring this show about how we integrate Christian faith into a very different time period than even it was 30 or 40 years ago, this 21st century. Well, tonight we're going to probe just a little bit deeper into this whole issue of postmodernism. We live in what we call a postmodern culture more and more. With every passing year, we experience postmodernism and its impact in a much greater way. And I know some people have never even heard the term postmodernism before. And if you have heard it, maybe you've been very confused and perhaps even a bit alarmed by what you've heard about postmodernism. And so we're going to explore how Christian faith relates to postmodernism, how to share the good news about Jesus in a postmodern culture. And we have a very exciting guest tonight, a returnee from a previous show. Ken Johnson will be with us in the next segment. But so we're going to be talking a little bit more about that in a moment. But before we do that, I want to do a little bit of advertising for some great products that Aspect Ministries has to offer through our branding, Mind Cuisine. Mind Cuisine is all about food for thought, about learning made easy. And in Mind Cuisine, we produce a number of books and videos that are designed to help you understand from a fact-based, non-biased, user-friendly perspective on some of the controversial religious issues of our day. For example, my first video is on understanding Islam. It's a 35-minute video that just gives the facts about where it came from, what they believe, what they teach, and some tips upon interaction with Muslim people in our culture. We have a number of religious videos, including one on the Bible, 45-minute Bible, which just gives you an overview of that great and cherished book. And then I want to show you just about a minute's long video clip from one of our most recent videos called Understanding the New Age, or I Know the New Age Movement. And it will give you some ideas that will, I think, lead you into thinking and discussion on this topic of postmodernism. So here's the clip. Enjoy, and we'll see you in about 60 seconds. In these early years of the 21st century, the New Age movement has become a familiar part of society. New Age ideas, practices, and terminology are a pervasive part of the everyday lives of millions of people. Now, when you hear the term New Age, a variety of things may come to mind. This term may conjure up the image of people sitting in a circle sharing some Eastern spiritual experience. Or perhaps you'll be reminded of a news story about a celebrity employing the techniques of feng shui in their home decor. Or maybe you'll think of a communal living situation where handicrafts and vegetarianism are the focus of group life. Many of us know or are related to people within this very diverse family of religions and philosophical groups. And perhaps you've wondered about what they believe and practice. This video is designed to give you insight into the overall origins and worldview of the New Age movement. Just as with our other videos in the Mind Cuisine I Know Religion series, the goal of this session is simply to present the facts in order to prepare you to intelligently discuss the subject with those around you. Well, I hope you enjoyed that brief clip from my video on the New Age movement. And of course that, as well as Understanding Islam, I Know Mormonism, I Know the Jehovah's Witnesses, and the 45-minute Bible can all be purchased from our commercial website called Mind Cuisine, MindCuisine.com. Just go to the product tab and it's all available there. And if you want to give us some feedback, we'd very much appreciate that. Well, let's get into the whole issue of postmodernism and what it is. As I said last week, we talked about a lot of this last week, but I'm going to try to take a little bit of a different angle this week. Postmodernism is not a unified belief system. It's not really a philosophy that's got all the angles of what it believes all tied up and squared away. Really, I guess the best way to understand postmodernism is it's more of a reaction against the core values and beliefs of the 20th century. Really, it's a reaction against all the things that people thought were important, all the ways that people viewed the world in the 20th century. And so, for example, in the 20th century, when people were searching for hard scientific facts, postmodernists are not as much interested in that as they are about how people feel about the facts, about their opinions. Instead of logical reasoning, postmodernism really searches for experiences and feelings instead of the logic of the 20th century. And instead of conforming to culture and values, which was such an emphasis in the last century, postmodernism emphasizes creativity and seeing things in alternative ways. So, with that little summary, let's explore some of the features of postmodernism. For example, the first feature I wanted to explain in a little bit more detail is that postmodernists believe that we need to see the world in different ways. We need to see the world in different ways. For example, 20th century, all about progress. I mean, technology is going to cause progress. Education is going to bring progress. We're going to just be advancing in all sorts of ways. And postmodernists would say, well, yes, there was some advance in terms of technology, in terms of education, in terms of government, things like that. But don't forget that the 20th century had a much darker side. And for example, that darker side includes, like nuclear weapons, the using of nuclear weapons in terms of the attack on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and nuclear testing since then and the Cold War. That was the dark side of the 20th century. Postmodernists would say that we need to reevaluate and see things in a very, very different way. And that the Holocaust is a result of some 20th century philosophies and ideas, and that the fact that people are still very involved in addictive behaviors and dehumanizing systems is a call for reevaluation. Secondly, postmodernism is skeptical of traditions and authorities. Postmodern people see that traditions, or at least they believe that traditions, are often used by people in authority as a way of controlling the people under them, and that leaders will use things in a selfish way to maintain their power and wealth, and they will use the rules and the policies and the traditional ways of doing things in order to maintain that wealth and control. That may be true sometimes, not always true, but postmodernism is very suspicious of people who have power and authority and maintain traditions. Postmodernism also explores ways of redefining truth and morality. They tend to see truth as a relative thing. Truth for me may be different than truth for you. That's the way they see it. They also don't believe that there is a single standard of truth or morality, and that everything is individually interpreted. And then they tend to see morality as relative to personal tastes. In other words, they tend to synthesize the experiences that they have. They tend to take this from this place and that from that place and synthesize things into their own personal reality. And that's the way that postmodernism tends to see things. Postmodernism also questions meta-narratives. Now, I know we talked about that last week. Meta-narratives is one of those fancy philosophical terms, but it just means big story. In other words, postmodern people tend to question whether there is one explanation for why the world is the way it is and why people act the way they do. So, for example, what's a meta-narrative? The Christian story is a meta-narrative. We believe that God created us in His image, that we have fallen from relationship with Him, and that God has pursued us and been in the process of working towards our redemption. And eventually that worked out in His incarnation in Jesus Christ, and His death on the cross, and His resurrection, and the proclamation of the good news where people can come back into relationship with God. Well, that's a meta-narrative. We Christians believe that is an authentic meta-narrative. It really is true. But still, it's a way of trying to explain why the world is the way it is and how people, should act. based upon a story that includes all of that information. Another example of a meta-narrative that many people follow is the theory of evolution. It's a story, it's a philosophy that tries to account for why life exists in all of its abundance and all of its specialization, and how it got that way if God's not directly part of the process. It's the only way you can think of to explain how that happened. Well, postmodernists tend to doubt all meta-narratives, not just the Christian one, all big stories about why things are the way they are and how they got that way. And so, in fact, history itself might be considered to be a meta-narrative. And I like that Calvin and Hobbes cartoon that you see on your screen where Calvin says to his stuffed tiger, Hobbes, he says, history is the fiction we invent to persuade ourselves that events are knowable and that life has order and direction. Well, that's a typically postmodern view of history. In other words, life doesn't necessarily have a meaning. There is no explanation. It's all sort of random. And then finally, postmodernism embraces globalism. They don't tend to think locally. They don't tend to think in terms of nation, family allegiance. They tend to think in terms of global kinds of things, environmentalism, social causes. And if they have any particular loyalty to a smaller unit, it's usually a very close-knit network of friends and relations. So they tend to think very close, very small, but also postmoderns tend to think very big. It's the middle ground that many postmoderns really don't deal with much and don't accept. Well, with that summary, we're going to come back in just a few minutes after our break. I'm going to continue to explain some of this as a way of introduction, and then we'll introduce our guest in a few minutes. But don't go away. We have a lot of fun left this evening. And go ahead and grab something to eat or drink, and don't go away because we'll be back in just about 3 minutes. See you then.
Optimal Hospice Foundation. Caring support when it matters most. Look us up at optimalhospicefoundation.com.
Maintain your independence with the caring support of an entire community at Cedar Creek Senior Living. For more information, call 559-474-4433.
We are conveniently located across from Bullard High School on North Palm Avenue in Fig Garden. Morales Wellness Dental offers quality-oriented family dental care and service in a personalized and comfortable manner. As you enter our office, you'll always be greeted by our warm, caring dental team and will be invited to relax in our finely appointed lobby. We have 7 patient treatment suites that feature monitors for your in-op entertainment and diagnostic review. Our comfortable hygienist suites are the ideal setting for regular cleanings and checkups. As safety is our utmost priority, all instruments are put through our modern sterilization center. Furthermore, our sedation suite offers you both comfort and peace of mind during advanced dental procedures. And for your privacy, we have 2 separate patient consultation offices. Take the worry out of your next dental visit by calling us today. Experience our commitment to excellence, respect, and honesty at Morales Wellness Dental.
Whether your wedding is rustic, vintage, formal, traditional, casual, elegant, or just a little outside the box, Black Tie and Bridal Lace has everything you need to dress your entire wedding party. Are you currently shopping for solar? Give Solar Negotiators a call. You see, what they do is they fill downtime at a reduced rate to make sure that you always get the best deal. Don't find out later that you could have bought your solar for thousands of dollars less. Call Solar Negotiators.
If you're looking to go solar with confidence and have someone represent you in this transaction, give Solar Negotiators a call at 844-OWN-SOLAR or visit solarnegotiators.com.
Looking for a travel agent? Look no further. Bianca Echeveste can make your travel dream a reality, even on a budget. Visit ilovemytravelbiz.com or call Bianca at 559-284-2217.
CentralValleyTalk.com.
Welcome back to 21st Century Faith. We've been talking about postmodernism and how postmodernism is really the culture that we live in. I've been describing some of the characteristics of postmodernism, and I'm going to pick up with anti-nationalism. Postmodern people feel like loyalty to a nation divides people. It causes haves and have-nots. It causes a lot of wars. That's a very postmodern idea. And then it's all about egalitarianism and pluralism, that everybody's status should be equal, that your status should not be based on family background, but on your individual qualities, not on your nationality or your skill set, but on the relationships that you have with people. And, of course, relationships are very important. And then, of course, environmentalism is a big, I guess you'd say, plank in the platform of postmodern ideas, that materialism has caused a real imbalance in environmental stability in the world. Well, with that summary, I need to step back for just a moment and talk about how Christianity interacts with postmodern ideas. Actually, postmodernism is nothing new. In fact, you could make the argument that the Christian message, the gospel, has interacted with postmodern kinds of ideas on a number of occasions throughout its 2,000-year history. For example, in John 18:37 through 38, Jesus is on trial before Pontius Pilate, and Pontius Pilate says to Jesus, and I'm quoting from this passage, "So you're a king?" Jesus answered, "You say correctly that I'm a king. For this I've been born, and for this I've come into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." And Pilate said to Jesus, "What is truth?" It's a very postmodern concept, a very postmodern reaction. And yet we find that the Christian message has always actually come out pretty well when it interacts correctly with postmodernism. For example, also, Jesus isn't just talking truth. Jesus is demonstrating truth through his life. In the record of the gospel, Jesus is healing people of diseases. He's healing them of emotional problems. He's healing relationships. Jesus is showing the power of God in miracles and changing people's lives. This is postmodern ministry at its best. The New Testament also talks about that in terms of the book of Acts and the Gospels. The apostles not only proclaim truth in terms of ideas, but they continue the ministry in which the power of God, invades the pluralistic world that they live in, and that the apostles' lives themselves have been transformed by this truth, and it's hard to argue against a changed life. So it's the authentic Christian experience that seems to intersect rather well with postmodern ideas. It's not just about talking about truth, it's about the experience of truth in a person's life. And so one thing is for sure, probably the experience of Christianity is going to be very different in the years ahead. It's going to look very different, as that graphic that's going to come up on the screen will show. That Christianity in the future is it's going to look a lot more like individual relationships centered around authentic Christian experience. Well, with that in mind, I'd like to introduce my guest for the evening. Ken Johnson has been my friend for, 7 or 8 years, something like that. We used to work together on staff of a local church here in Fresno. and we got to know each other. Kind of sparred with each other intellectually sometimes, but it's great to have. Now Ken now works for the County of Fresno.
That is correct.
And he's a job specialist. Also a graduate of Fresno Pacific University with a degree in New Testament. Glad to welcome you onto the show, Ken.
Thank you.
Value your ideas on this whole subject of postmodernism. Tell us a little bit about your own personal journey before we begin with the actual discussion questions.
All right. I would begin with certainly raised in the church, raised in the faith. And when it comes to the ideas of postmodernism, the ideas of just Christianity in a different way, I started experimenting or experiencing, I should say, some of that about 10 to 15 years ago working for a church and just experiencing God in a new way, experiencing that there's ways to embrace Christianity, embrace the teachings of Scripture without having to do that strictly through the lens of modernism. I had a lot of friends who really started to stretch me and pull me and guide me in different directions. And some of the issues that you were talking about of environmentalism and anti-nationalism, things like that I would never even have thought of before, now I started to embrace and say, you know what, I think God is doing something there. I think that God is working in those areas that I would never have looked at before.
Now, you mentioned modernism, so let's read, for those who just jumped into the program. Modernism was the philosophy of the 20th century, progress through technology and education and all of that. And we tend to, what we did in the American church was we adapted the Christian message to a modernist way of thinking in the 20th century. That's what you're going to do.
And it really starts centuries earlier. Mm-hmm. I mean, modernism did not just happen in the 20th century, it culminated in the 20th century and then began to break down in the 20th century, which we're now into the 21st century, with postmodernism taking over, starting in the 50s, 60s, really moving in the 70s, and now completely taking over thought patterns.
Right. And all we're talking about is how Christianity has taken its message, and in every generation, with almost every worldview, it's had to figure out ways to communicate effectively, and it's actually done a remarkable job of that over the centuries. So let's start with some questions. Given you heard my explanation of postmodernism just now, is there anything about it that you want to add, emphasize?
I think the only thing I want to add is just sometimes there's a perspective of postmodernism that it is not compatible with Christianity. Unfortunately, that's like you were just identifying. It may not be compatible with modernism's version of Christianity, but that doesn't mean it's not compatible with Christianity today. And for Christianity into the future, it will be the prevalent thought pattern. So that's the only thing I'd want to add is just there will be Christianity in the future through a postmodern mindset.
Yeah, okay. And there are things about postmodernism that are incompatible with Christianity.
Right.
Like for example, can you give some ideas what those might be?
Well, one in particular would be accepting Scripture as authoritative, where if all religious texts have some sort of authoritative message, which is a postmodern concept, really it's more of a pluralistic concept, but postmodern would embrace it, that would not be acceptable in Christianity. It just is not compatible. Christianity has to rise above to say, no, the Scriptures that we embrace as the biblical text is an authority in our lives over and against all other texts.
So in other words, Christians would have to disagree with the common idea that, the Bible's one form of truth and the Quran's another form of truth and the Bhagavad Gita is another form of truth, that Christianity is going to need to say, God has communicated through Holy Scripture.
Right. However, you will hear a lot of postmodern Christians start to say, well, although the Bible is the authority, that doesn't mean there's something we can't learn from some of those other texts. And so they would be willing to read them. It doesn't mean they're reading them on the same level as the Bible, but they're willing to read them, willing to say, you know what, is there a little bit of truth that we're gaining from here? If all truth does come from God, then there has to be something that we can learn from there as well. It doesn't mean it supersedes it. It just means that let's not completely ignore these other religious texts as well.
So you think that there'll be some postmodern Christians that will take that?
I think so. Doesn't mean I'm embracing that. I'm just saying that that's reality.
Right. We have to be real clear here what we're saying. So give some ways postmodernism impacts daily experience. I mean, the average person on the street, what does postmodernism have to do with their lives? We've got about a little less than 4 minutes here.
I think one way it impacts their daily lives is just the way that they will look at reality today. They're going to look at the scientific world and say, does that mesh with what I'm hearing from the Christian message? They're going to look at other religious texts and say, okay, I'm hearing these other religious leaders, and does that mesh with what you are claiming in Christianity? When I open my newspaper and I read, nobody opens newspaper anymore. When I open my iPad and I read my messages on CNN's app that talks about religious warfare, how is that meshing with what you're claiming in Christianity? These are all things that are running through someone's thought patterns, as opposed to 50 years ago, the height of modernism, 60 years ago, height of modernism. Those were all just givens. Christianity was superior. Christianity was the message. And in reality, those would never even be thought about. It's like, no, this is the one way of thinking and all the other ways must be wrong. But today they're going to say, well, wait a minute, maybe they're not all wrong. Maybe there's some things I can learn from them. And Christianity has to do an extra effort to show where their message is the message of God, the message that Christ has revealed.
So in other words, what you're saying, that postmodernism affects the average person on the street in terms of them thinking that there's lots of different avenues of truth, lots of different ways to access reality. And one of the struggles Christianity has to do in the 21st century is to say, no, we have a message that really needs to be considered as the best way to see things.
Certainly.
And probably the crispest, most true view of reality.
Yeah, most true. That's a tough concept to deal with postmodernity.
Yeah. So what about Christian people? Are they also affected by postmodernism?
I think they are. I think they are because they are experiencing more ways of thinking than was presented maybe 60, 50 years ago. So they have to figure out, what am I willing to embrace? You used the example of evolution earlier, and so some Christians are starting to say, hey, how do I deal with that? My science book is teaching this, my Sunday school teacher is teaching this, and do the two mesh together? Is it just two ways of thinking? Is one completely right, one completely wrong, or is there a little truth in each of them? Probably the postmodern concept would say there's a little truth in each of them. And so Christians are trying to work through that. They're trying to figure that out. I would say another area would be how to embrace people who are different than them, where a lot of the things that you are touching on and teaching on in some of your Mind Cuisine material is saying, look, there are different people surrounding us all the time. What are we going to do to embrace them and not completely shut them out?
I visited London several years ago, and the thing that really struck me was what a little representation of the world London is. I mean, there's people from every country you can think of there, every language. And if you want a picture of postmodernism, go to a large metropolitan area in the world, and you will have to deal with many cultures and many ideas. The question is, how does Christianity come into that situation with the good news? So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. We've got a break coming up here. It seems like the breaks happen pretty regularly here. But we're going to talk about that in the next segment. So don't go away. I think we've got some great questions and discussion left ahead. And we'll see you in just a few minutes when we come back from our commercial break.
Foundation. Caring support when it matters most. Look us up at optimalhospicefoundation.com.
Maintain your independence with the caring support of an entire community at Cedar Creek Senior Living. For more information, call 559-474-4433.
We are conveniently located across from Bullard High School on North Palm Avenue in Fig Garden. Morales Wellness Dental offers quality-oriented family dental care and service in a personalized and comfortable manner. As you enter our office, you'll always be greeted by our warm, caring dental team and will be invited to relax in our finely appointed lobby. We have 7 patient treatment suites that feature monitors for your in-op entertainment and diagnostic review. Our comfortable hygienist suites are the ideal setting for regular cleanings and checkups. As safety is our utmost priority, all instruments are put through our modern sterilization center. Furthermore, our sedation suite offers you both comfort and peace of mind during advanced dental procedures. And for your privacy, we have 2 separate patient consultation offices. Take the worry out of your next dental visit by calling us today. Experience our commitment to excellence, respect, and honesty at Morales Wellness Dental.
Whether your wedding is rustic, vintage, formal, traditional, casual, elegant, or just a little outside the box, black tie and bridal lace has everything you need to dress your entire wedding party. Are you currently shopping for solar? Give Solar Negotiators a call. You see, what they do is they fill downtime at a reduced rate to make sure that you always get the best deal. Don't find out later that you could have bought your solar for thousands of dollars less. Call Solar Negotiators.
If you're looking to go solar with confidence and have someone represent you in this transaction, give Solar Negotiators a call at 844-OWN-SOLAR or visit solarnegotiators.com.
Looking for a travel agent? Look no further. Bianca Echeveste can make your travel dream a reality, even on a budget. Visit ilovemytravelbiz.com or call Bianca at 559-284-2217.
CentralValleyTalk.com.
Welcome back to our third segment of 21st Century Faith. I'm Michael Bogart. We're talking about postmodernism tonight and how Christianity functions in a postmodern culture, how you bring good news to people who think postmodern. And we've talked about how Christianity's adapted and been able to effectively communicate its message in many different situations and cultures, and this is really no different. So I'm here with Ken Johnson tonight, an old friend of mine who's really done a lot of reading on postmodernism, has a degree from Fresno Pacific University in New Testament. And I'm going to ask a few more questions of Ken. Ken, how is postmodernism impacting the church's programs and operations these days?
Well, I think one thing you're seeing is you're seeing in churches that would really embrace a postmodern mindset, programs are breaking down, relationships are rising, where a program to create people to get together or to fabricate a relational experience is breaking down. But on the other hand, what you have is you have churches that naturally want to meet together. What do I mean by that? You have house churches, and they'll meet together in groups of 10, 12, 15 for Bible study. It might be around a common meal that they'll all work together and share. Very first century, very, very New Testament, and yet not traditional church and having a location to go to or a program to make that happen. So programs are breaking down, relationships are rising.
Okay, so, we establish programs in the church, to say, we're having a Bible study on this night, and, it's going to be on this subject, and we want a bunch of people to come. You're saying that that's becoming less popular, and spontaneous things that people set up themselves are becoming more interesting.
Yeah, certainly more intriguing. It may not necessarily be spontaneous. It might be every Tuesday evening or every Wednesday night.
But they're set up not by the leadership, they're set up by the people themselves.
By the people themselves, yeah. And people are going to want to gather together and study the Word together and not
study the Word, meaning study the Bible.
Yeah, and not be dependent on the professional pastor to be there, but on the highly educated individuals who are part of that congregation, that little house church perhaps. They're the ones who are going to get together and study Scripture together. They're the ones who are going to share their own thoughts and embrace the thoughts of every person who's present, highly educated, not highly educated, but all of them studying the Word together.
Now, as a religious professional and as someone who's got quite a bit of training and experience, that could be a very threatening concept because, in a sense, you've lost control of that group. You don't know what's going to happen in that group.
Certainly.
And, in fact, I've seen this, very successful pastors who don't have as much training as I do. Mm-hmm. How should I feel about that in a postmodern society?
Well, hopefully you're embracing it and seeing God at work and not feeling intimidated or even scared or watching things be ripped away or pulled away from you. But hopefully you can say, God is doing something. I think about the story of Henry Nouwen. Henry Nouwen was a Catholic priest who left a professorship at Harvard to go and work with adults with disabilities. He was asked to speak one time, to go and speak. And he said, I'll only go if I can take one of my guys with me, one of the guys with adult disabilities. When he got there, he refused to speak and said, no, he's speaking. I think the guy's name was Bill, but he said, no, I'm not speaking, but Bill is speaking. And he got paid a whole lot of money to show up and speak, and he said, no. Bill has just as important things to say about what God is doing than what I have to say. That's a very postmodern concept that all of us, all egalitarian, all of us have an opportunity to share what God is doing, not just the Harvard professor.
And yet we want to know, what are Bill's qualifications? And
yeah.
why should we listen to Bill?
And they didn't pay for Bill either.
Right, and we know him, we don't know Bill.
Exactly.
So, yeah, okay, well.
But yet, that's starting to be embraced today in some churches, where churches are saying, you know what, everyone has a voice. From the pastor who's been to seminary to the homeless guy who's coming off the street, we're all studying the Word together, not just one person sharing and everyone else sitting and listening.
Well, if we are talking about a much more of an emphasis on experiencing the presence and power of God in our lives, then that really is accessible to just about everybody. I mean, if you're open
I would
to
hope
it,
so.
Yeah, right, and you don't need schooling to get that. Now, let me just say, on the other side of the equation, schooling is a good thing.
I agree.
It does keep you on track and grounded, and it teaches some pretty valuable things.
Yeah, and I always think there'll be a place for pastors, for professors, for religious education in that capacity. I went to seminary myself, loved my experience there. And there's insights that I've been able to get, there's commentaries I've been able to read because of the time I spent there that I would hopefully want to share with that same congregation.
Right.
But just because I didn't there, because I have letters behind my name, does not mean he's the answer. He's the authority. There might be a lot of things that I read that text and completely overlook that someone just off the street who has the Spirit of God active in his life, who's going to read things that I never saw.
Well, yeah, I think one of the most enlightening things that happened to me, and I also have a seminary education and working on a doctorate at the moment, but teaching overseas in cross-cultural experiences where people don't have a lot of education and you're studying the Bible, and somebody makes a comment, and my initial reaction as an American with an education is, that's wrong. But sometimes you think a little deeply and you think, from their perspective, I can see why he would make that comment.
Sure.
And I can see that in that culture, it's a valid application. That was a real paradigm switch for me.
Sure.
And I'm glad for it, too. Well, let's talk about how postmodernism is compatible with biblical Christianity. In what ways is actually this not a problem, but a great opportunity for the gospel?
Yeah, let's go with the idea of egalitarian, where the gospel, the New Testament is highly egalitarian. Everyone had everything in common. Everyone was the same. Yes, they had apostles. Yes, they had pastors who were leading. I don't deny that. But they met in small settings. All the people brought together the things that they believed. They thought, they were listening to the apostles' teachings. They were learning from them, but I'm sure they talked about them and discussed them. And in today's culture, which is way more educated than that culture was, we have even more opportunities to bring that sort of insight. So I think that's a great way that biblical faith grows out of a postmodern concept. It's not just drive Sunday morning, listen to the professional, drive home. It's let's talk about this all week. Let's study together all week long. We all can learn together. I think that's a great way that biblical faith grows out of postmodernity.
So the whole egalitarian component of postmodernism, you think, lends itself to a real proclamation of the good news.
I think so. Another area is just simply, you mentioned earlier, the experience of God, the experience of Christianity. We see in cultures around the world, when it comes to Christianity, one of the fastest, if not the fastest growing movement in Christianity is the Pentecostal apostolic movement. Experiencing God. It's experiencing the Holy Spirit. A lot of moderns don't experience a lot of Holy Spirit. And so here's a chance to see God at work in the lives of individuals. I think it's very attractive to our culture and very attractive to Christianity in the future. And it's also, again, very New Testament, very first century.
So postmodernism can really line up with certain aspects of the New Testament.
I think so.
Well, let's explore something a little bit more concrete. What's working today? What kinds of ministry are really working in a postmodern culture?
I think what you're going to see working in postmodern culture when it comes to ministry, when it comes to Christianity, is you're going to see a change in the way you understand church. Church is not a building. It's a body of people. Now, we talk about that all the time, but we don't always live that. So I think you're starting to see that more in house churches, in small fellowships. You're starting to see that in people who really want to get together, but not around certain doctrines or principles. They've moved away from that. So you're starting to see church change. Just the idea of church change. The idea of family has changed. What is a family in church? What is a biblical family? That's a great concept to talk about, postmodern, where biblical families were all messed up and screwed up. We have this idea, which is much more Victorian. What is a biblical family?
Mom, dad, kids. Yeah.
Yeah, and today that's all changing. What is family is all changing. We have single parents. We have same-gender parents. We have heterosexual parents. We've got broken families. We've got kids from there. All of that is being changed. Grandma's raising kids. So because of that, postmodernity looks at it and says, all of that can be embraced and accepted. It's not just the nuclear family, the traditional family. So that's changing. And churches are starting to say, well, how do I embrace that differently?
Well, in other words, churches can say, maybe we can be a family as a church.
Yeah.
And bring in people that really don't fit anyplace else.
Well, hopefully that's the whole point of the church.
Yeah, I think that concept is pretty New Testament. Again, I'm reminded of Africa, where you've got a lot of dispossessed people, and I remember being bewildered as an American, thinking, these people are attached to each other, but they're not really related by blood, but they're in the same household. They live in the house because they're attached through some sort of loyalty bonds. And again, not being an African, it's hard for me to really understand how that works. But they have a much more New Testament concept because they've got households, including non-blood related people, whereas we don't really have that concept as much.
Yeah, the whole "it takes a village" idea is really embraced in postmodernity as well. The concept of who is my family, who is my friends. Friends are far more family today in a lot of postmoderns than actual bloodlines, because they may have had bad experiences with their actual bloodlines. So you're seeing that change. And so the church has to embrace that. The church has got to look for that and say, you know what, let's really hold on to what God is doing amongst these people. Let's embrace these friendships that are functioning as families and say, you know what, you are the support network of that individual. You are the one that they can lean on. If their parents maybe are messed up or screwed up, they have someone else who they can lean on as family.
So how does the church do that? I mean, we've only got about a minute left till the next break, but are there ways that the church can say, we are your family. We're here for you?
Yeah, there are. There absolutely are. Through ways of embracing people who are different than them, they can say, we are your family. You may not feel like you fit in anywhere else, but you fit in here every single day. That is a concept that the church must embrace, cannot be excluding people, cannot be pushing people away, has to be opening its doors to say, we are here to love you and embrace you. Doesn't mean that we accept everything about you, but it means we love you and we embrace you for who you are, because maybe their family wouldn't, because maybe other people wouldn't, but the church has to be that. In the 21st century, the 22nd century, the 23rd century, that has to be the church.
Well, and it was true in the first century, and that's one of the reasons why the church turned the Roman Empire upside down, was because the church was the one place where people were accepted for what they were in Jesus. More about that after this break.
Foundation. Caring support when it matters most. Look us up at optimalhospicefoundation.com.
Maintain your independence with the caring support of an entire community at Cedar Creek Senior Living. For more information, call 559-474-4433.
We are conveniently located across from Bullard High School on North Palm Avenue in Fig Garden. Morales Wellness Dental offers quality-oriented family dental care and service in a personalized and comfortable manner. As you enter our office, you'll always be greeted by our warm, caring dental team and will be invited to relax in our finely appointed lobby. We have 7 patient treatment suites that feature monitors for your in-op entertainment and diagnostic review. Our comfortable hygienist suites are the ideal setting for regular cleans and checkups. As safety is our utmost priority, all instruments are put through our modern sterilization center. Furthermore, our sedation suite offers you both comfort and peace of mind during advanced dental procedures. And for your privacy, we have 2 separate patient consultation offices. Take the worry out of your next dental visit by calling us today. Experience our commitment to excellence, respect, and honesty at Morales Wellness Dental.
Whether your wedding is rustic, vintage, formal, traditional, casual, elegant, or just a little outside the box, black tie and bridal lace has everything you need to dress your entire wedding party. Are you currently shopping for solar? Give Solar Negotiators a call. You see, what they do is they fill downtime at a reduced rate to make sure that you always get the best deal. Don't find out later that you could have bought your solar for thousands of dollars less. Call Solar Negotiators.
If you're looking to go solar with confidence and have someone represent you in this transaction, give Solar Negotiators a call at 844-OWN-SOLAR or visit solarnegotiators.com.
Looking for a travel agent? Look no further. Bianca Echeveste can make your travel dream a reality, even on a budget. Visit ilovemytravelbiz.com or call Bianca at 559-284-2217.
CentralValleyTalk.com.
So, Ken, we're talking about postmodernism. In our final segment, I wanted to pursue just a couple more of the questions that we sort of got into before. Are there things we should really avoid as Christians proclaiming the good news in a time that's becoming more and more postmodern in its concepts?
Yeah, I would say one area is an area we started to touch on before, and that's the idea of exclusivity. Postmodernism does not embrace exclusivity. Everybody's got a voice. Everybody's got an opportunity to be included. And I think that the church has done a poor job at that. The church has done a much better job at who's in, who's out, who's us, who's them. And we need to do a better job at saying, how can we embrace you? How can we love you? How can we care about you? How can we show that you can be part of the family of God?
Okay, so just a couple follow-up on that. Number one, that doesn't mean you accept everybody's behavior
Right.
or values or lifestyle.
Right.
Okay. But secondly, I just, what you said triggered something in my mind. I had an opportunity to visit a church several months ago in a different part of the country. And the pastor of that church, very postmodern ministry, said, most churches have the approach that you bring somebody to faith in Jesus and then you include them in the family of God, the church. He says, we don't do that. We just turn it around in this church. Mm-hmm. We accept people into our family, and in the process of that, maybe sometime later, many of them put their faith in Jesus. It's kind of like family first, then faith. Traditionally, we've always done it the other way around. Faith first, then family. You think that's valid?
There's probably some validity there. If someone on the outside of Christianity is feeling nothing but exclusion, you commonly hear I can't go to church. I'm all messed up. I got to get cleaned up first. But yet, that's not what God wants us to do. That's not the way Christ calls people. He would call people into their family, into his family first, and then let's clean you up. And then let's fix the tax collectors and the sinners and the prostitutes and all of that he was hanging out with. But he was hanging out with them first. The church does a really poor job at that. We do a really good job at saying, no. Get all those things straight in your life, then come worship with us. But you're that pastor friend who's saying, no, let's do it the other way. Let's do it like Jesus, who really went to those people, loved them, cared about them, embraced them as they were, and then let's work on those issues.
Right. And even there, we would probably say, but there is some basic standard of behavior while you're with us.
Yeah.
And certainly don't come smashed drunk and don't use all kinds of language that's going to embarrass people and that sort of thing. There would be some standards, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Well, and we've got just a few more minutes before we do our mentoring moment, but you brought up the idea not too long ago about Christendom and post-Christendom. Why don't you just explore that a little bit?
Yeah, Christendom, the concept of Christendom is where Christianity is just the prevailing thought. It's the prevailing idea. And it's the idea of really bringing Christianity and kingdom together. So it's a Christendom idea. It really reached its peak, at least in America, Western culture, probably in the 1950s. But it started to crumble. It started to break down. The 1960s, with all of the turmoil of that time, was one way that broke down. So we live in a post-Christian culture. We live in a post-Christendom culture where Christianity is not the prevailing thought. It is one amongst many. We live in a culture that if you make reference on the man on the street to who was Ruth, would have no idea who Ruth was. But 60, 70 years ago, probably would know who that person was. So we live in a world today, a culture today.
Or David and Goliath.
Sure, David and Goliath. And they may know of some news story where some little guy beat up a big guy and that was David and Goliath, but don't know the biblical concept behind it. So we live in a culture that's behind that or beyond that, and so because of that, it's called post-Christendom, where we cannot take things for granted anymore. We can't take Christianity as being understood anymore. Some would say this is absolutely great because never was the first century church ever in Christendom. Christendom didn't come around until probably the 4th century. Right. So that was a wonderful time of incredible growth and explosion in the church. So not necessarily a bad thing.
Well, in some ways, we have the opportunity to present the biblical stories, the biblical message fresh.
Yeah.
It's not falling on ears, like you say, 60, 70 years ago. If people didn't believe it, they'd still heard it all. And it's like they could say, I've heard all that. Now, a lot of people can't say they've heard all that. It's like, really, that's in the Bible?
Oh, I had a friend who was ministering in a church, 2 Christian kids in Chicago who were completely foreign to the Old Testament stories. And so he got the opportunity to teach these junior high school kids for the very first time David and Goliath or David and Bathsheba and how messed up that story was and how these kids can go, wow, that's just like today. That's like what we're learning about today. And the fresh eyes that they brought was really cool. It was a wonderful opportunity for him.
You know, this 45-minute Bible thing that I've spent so much time advertising on this show, I use it in some of my college classes where I teach.
Cool.
It's an extra credit assignment. They don't have to do it, but if they want to watch this 45-minute Bible, I have so many students when they write their little report on this extra credit assignment will say, I got to get my Bible out. I've never heard any of this stuff. It's the most interesting book I've ever read. And so, at least parts of it are. And so, I think what we're saying is it can be very fresh to people. It's not old hat.
Yeah, I would agree.
So maybe that's an advantage of being in a post-Christian culture.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Anything else you want to add? I mean, is there hope, Ken?
I would say yes. I would say that there's yes in that God is going to continue to move. God is going to continue to do things. Some say that God is doing something new in using postmodernity. Others say God is not embracing that thought pattern at all. But I would say no. I think God is moving in a new direction. I think that God is up to something new. I think He's moving His people to be active in the world in a whole new way of thinking, to minister to a lost generation who does not embrace Christianity, does not embrace Christendom, but does start to show some interest in some of these biblical stories they've never heard, or particularly in the things that Jesus did, the people He hung out with, and the ways that He ministered to people. That's very attractive. And so because of that, I would say absolutely there's hope. God is still moving. God is still at work. And we're going to see some great things happen, but there will be growing pains to get there.
Well, I think we need to remember that the first century where the church blossomed, and especially first and second centuries where the church was vastly in a minority, is the time when it had its greatest growth. Yeah. However, martyrdom went with that, and also other kinds of pressure. There have been those who would argue that Christianity does best under some kind of pressure.
Yeah.
When there's no pressure, well, we don't perform at our best. Not that I want pressure. May God spare us from suffering, but we know that the gospel does best when there's a little bit of pressure applied. Yeah. So maybe that's what's ahead for us. We hope in a good way. Well, I'm going to move on now. Thank you very much, Ken.
You're welcome.
For being with us tonight. I hope that God blesses you in your new pursuits and your new job. And sounds like a real exciting opportunity for you. We're going to move on now to the last little part of our show. Many of you know my dad just turned 85 last week. And we wished him a happy 85th birthday. And he's always been kind to contribute a little segment. I think one of the most important aspects of faith in the 21st century is going to be this mentoring from one generation to another. And my dad's always been good to mentor me and my brothers. And so he's sent this weekly installment called letters from Mount Olivet about a fictitious city that's something like what we used to live, a city where we used to live back in the Midwest. But I'm just going to read what my dad says in this letter. Hi, son. Not a lot to report from Mount Olivet today. Ed the cop doesn't seem to be in a very forgiving mood today. He's fined 8 speeders coming over the hill, and they haven't been too happy about it. The weather remains hot, but we've had a bit of rain, which may have made the blueberries down in the bog ripen a bit quicker and grow in size. Ed and the Mount Olivet speeders have drawn attention to an important concept that's been bothering me for some time. It's the concept of forgiveness. Some years ago, when I was in a position of leadership, 2 of those with whom I served seemingly were working against me to the point that I had to step aside. I blamed them, and I haven't found it within my heart to forgive them. One was my predecessor, who passed away earlier this year, and the second worked alongside me in the job as an assistant. I don't think she liked my style of management from the start, so she conveniently disregarded many of my requests and took a leave of absence, leaving me without any assistance. I know what the Bible says about forgiving in dozens of passages, but it's been almost impossible to forgive either of them because they hurt me so terribly. As you know, I'm not a mean or spiteful person. I do insist on being informed, but I feel I was betrayed. As a Christian, I know I need to forgive them both, but my hurt is deep, and forgiving them is not coming easy. To try to reach some resolution, I've done some surface research to refresh my memory on what the Bible has to say on that topic, as well as some quotes from people I respect. One of my favorite passages comes from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 7, verses 44 to 50. There, turning toward the woman, he said, Simon, do you see this woman? I entered your house, and you gave me no water for my feet, but she's wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You gave me no kiss, but from the time I came in, she's not ceased to kiss my feet. You did not anoint my head with oil, but she's anointed my feet with ointment. Therefore, I tell you, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much. But he who is forgiven little loves little. And he said to her, your sins are forgiven. To me, this is the most humble illustration of forgiveness. Mahatma Gandhi once said, the weak can never forgive. Forgiveness is the attribute of the strong. Well, I guess I'm not very strong, son. In my research, I found several humorous quotes dealing with forgiveness, and these folks allow me to begin to laugh at our reluctance to forgive others. Oscar Wilde is quoted as saying, with tongue-in-cheek, I suppose, always forgives your enemies. Nothing annoys them so much as that. Knowing you're a C.S. Lewis fan and you and your brothers like the Hobbit book, actually, he didn't write the Hobbit, that was Tolkien. But he says, there are 2 kinds of people, Lewis says there are 2 kinds of people who say to God, those who say to God, thy will be done, and those to whom God says, all right, thy will be done. Finally, the last relevant quote is from Honest Abe Lincoln. He said, the best way to destroy an enemy is to make him a friend. Well, Mike, I don't need to carry on and on about my unwillingness to forgive. I can only believe that there are many others like me who have a difficult time forgiving those we feel who have wronged us. Nonetheless, if we're Christian believers, we have no choice but to follow the words of Matthew chapter 6, verse 14. For if you forgive others their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. I love you, son, Dad. Dad, thanks for that honesty. I think many people can relate to the difficulty it is to forgive people. So we've come to the time when we need to kind of summarize what we're talking about. We're going to move on next week. We're not going to be talking about postmodernism. My guest next week is going to be talking about the amazing explosion of churches and gospel among Hispanic people, not only in the United States, but also in Latin America. And it's probably been one of the least publicized, least understood revivals in history, but yet it's happening. And my guest is an expert on that, a good friend of mine, Pastor Jonathan Villalobos. We're going to be looking forward to having him. Lots happening in the 21st century when it regards Christian faith. And I believe we're on the verge of some unprecedented breakthroughs for the good news of Jesus Christ. I think sometimes we Christians panic far too soon because there's some good things happening. Some trials, some disappointments, certainly. But some good things are happening. So I would encourage us to pray and to hold on, to believe that God's a big God and he hasn't lost control. He's not on coffee break, and that God is very active. And if we'll trust Him and be creative and faithful to His Word, good days lie ahead, and perhaps some of the best days the Christian faith has ever experienced. I'm Mike Bogart with Aspect Ministries. We'll see you next week.
Thanks so much for joining us on today's 21st Century Faith. Mike Bogart would love to hear from you. So if you have any questions or you'd like to dialogue with Mike, please feel free to use the contact information you see on the screen. And we hope you'll come back and bring a friend to the next program of 21st Century Faith.